welcome to the latest episode of the Modern Brewer podcast with me, your host, Chris Lewington. It's been a few extra weeks since my last episode, and for the regular listeners, I really do apologize. I've actually been away on holiday to Canada visiting some friends, which was a real blast. I must admit, it was really fun. But for the purpose of this podcast, I actually also got to tour the Vancouver beer scene, which is, let me tell you, outstanding. I actually also bumped into some other brewing podcast people from Vancouver. They run a podcast called Why This Beer, and we ended up going around a bunch of breweries together. And I think we're going to record some sort of cool crossover episode shortly. So I'm actually going to look forward to that quite a lot. Kind of a nice way of business and pleasure on holiday. Always fun when you're including beer, right? Aside from that, for those who follow me on LinkedIn, you may have seen that I recently released my craft beer sustainability report for 2024. And this year, I completely revamped how I wrote the report. The report still contains all the trend data for the benchmarking reports I fill out for breweries all across the UK and Europe. It still offers the only kind of sustainability insight like this in the whole of Europe, which is something I'm still really, really proud of. The metrics I report on are always the same: brewhouse efficiency, water, electric, and gas intensity, and also purchase CO2 intensity. But I also decided this year to make it more actionable for brewers and business owners. So I included over 15 strategic decisions that a business owner can make, over 21 actionable changes for brewers, and I referenced over 15 further learning resources. So if you'd like to get a copy of the report, please check out the show notes where I've placed a link in there. For those who have already commented on my post and received the report, thank you so much, and thank you for your patience. I decided, for reasons that I am absolutely not too sure on now, to release this report via LinkedIn the day before I flew to Canada, and the post kicked off. I was literally on the plane as it was taking off, DMing people the link to the report. Which was an incredibly restful start to the holiday. So yeah, thank you to anyone who had the patience. Sometimes it took me a few hours to get those arseholes flying in different time zones, etc. So I do really appreciate your patience. But now let's talk about this episode. I have long been friends with Fergus and Dan, who run one of the most historic and, to me, important breweries in the UK brewing scene, Adnams. Located in the heart of the East Coast seaside town of Southwold, Adnams is truly a part of the community. If you ever get the privilege of going there, it's one of the most historic breweries that's literally located in the center of the town, with views of the sea and pipes that run under the road from building to building. It really reminds you of those like European breweries that have just been there for so long. The town has grown around them. It's so cool. Seriously, what a place. In this episode, we're going to be talking a lot about the history of Adnams, their unique Southwold Square fermenters, their even more unique dual yeast strain that defines the Adnams beer taste, and some amazing anecdotes about that ironclad mash tun that was so pitted it needed to be cleaned by hand in between each brew. But just before we do, I want to take a moment to talk about yeast, fermentation, and the science behind making better beer. Today, we're diving into AEB, a company that's been pushing brewing innovation for over 60 years. AEB started in winemaking, but has become a leader in brewing solutions, working with breweries worldwide to enhance your yeast selection, better your fermentations, and increase your process efficiency. Whether it's a crisp lager, a hazy New England IPA, or even a non-alc, they've got yeast strains and fermentation tools designed to enhance flavor, improve consistency, and reduce brewing costs. Brewers like Northern Monk, Pigeon Hill Brewing, and Nils Oskar Brewery have collaborated with AEB on brewing projects from yeast selection to filtration and stability. Their Thermo brew range is tackling low and no alcohol beers, bringing in citrus and tropical notes where traditional strains fall flat. And if you're struggling with haze or stability, AEB's clarification and filtration solutions help keep your beer looking and tasting its best without compromising foam retention or aroma. From yeast nutrients to process optimization, AEB is bringing science into the brew house in ways that make beer better and brewing smarter. Want to learn more? Visit AEB's website. The link is in my show notes. Right, okay, let's get going. Welcome to the show, Fergus Fitzgerald and Dan Gooderham.
Hello, Chris.
Hello.
You guys, haven't seen you in a bit of time, eh? I know we've worked a lot together over the last few years, and I still get to come down to sunny Southwold sometimes. Yeah, it's nice to see you again. And for the people watching on YouTube, they can actually see us talking for once rather than just hearing.
I'm not sure that's a good thing, is it, Chris?
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Actually, yeah, maybe not.
I'm speaking from my side, not yours, Chris.
So, look, guys, for the people who don't know you, who are listening to this, maybe we can just start off with a few intros, kind of what you are, what you do, sorry, and who you are.
That's pretty deep questions for this time of the morning.
Yeah. What is your why? That's the. Yeah, let's kick off with you, Fergus. Let's go.
So I'm production director at Adnams. So I look after the wider sort of brewing, distillery, the supply chain, logistics, all the sort of getting it to people. And I joined Adnams about 20 years ago as sort of assistant brewer. Although it was shortened to AS brewer at the time. That was the acronym. So I joined from Fuller's, where I spent 7 years, and then I joined Adnams and was head brewer then from about 2008 till Dan took it over.
Yeah, so I've been with Adnams 14 years. Pretty much really only worked at Adnams. That's where I've cut my mustard. Still very young. Not as young as Chris, yeah. But yeah, I did Harriet Watt. Did work at Fuller's for a short time in the lab there, but yeah, been here for the most part.
Yeah.
How's out of interest, how much has Adnams changed over the time that you've both been there?
Well, for me, it's changed completely, really. So when I joined, it was a Victorian brew house, and that's not a metaphor. It was actually Victorian equipment. You know, it was cast iron mash tuns. It was coppers. It was coppers with very little copper left because they've been used so often. And you sort of joke about it, but it was being held together by the wooden cladding on the outside. And we know that because when we stripped it away, a lot of the copper fell away as well. And the cast iron mash tuns had flakes of cast iron coming off every brew, really. So there was it was really difficult to sort of work with because after every second brew, we had to do a full CIP on the mash tun because it was so pitted. The sort of the microbiological flora enjoyed it too well. So by the second brew, it was just a mess. So you had to do a full CIP every second brew. So it was at a stage where it had to be replaced, really. So going from that sort of brew house where it was very manual, very Victorian, and you've been up, obviously, it's a relatively state of the art sort of brew house now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a cast iron mash tun.
Yeah. and they were undersized, so we had to mash in over the sparge arms. They were sort of 2 ton and 3 ton, and you had to mash both of them in over the sparge arms to get a sort of a decent sized brew out of them, and then run off until they drop below the sparge arms to be able to sparge it. So yeah, it was a lot of fun, but not always great fun.
Were you still sweetening the beer with lead acetate?
No, we had moved on. And it was all, so the fermentation side was a sort of hodgepodge of different fermentation vessels, mostly open vessels, but some round, some square, some plastic, some stainless, all lots of different sizes, lots of different shapes. It'd always been put together over a period of time, and as lots of breweries do, you sort of grab what's on the market at the time. So that's what the previous brewers, the previous engineering managers had to do. They had to go and find the cheapest vessel they could find to fit in that space, and that just gives you a lot of inconsistency. So all the big sort of round fermented vessels had to be cleaned out by hand. So yeah, lots of manual scrubbing.
That's mental.
It was normal, Chris.
How long ago was that? Wasn't even that. How long ago was that?
Oh, last year.
Yeah.
No, so I joined in 2004, and the new brew house went in 2007. So sort of between that time, we were running on the old brew house, and the fermenters we had started to change into sort of more modern squares from about 2001, and that sort of finished in about 2005, 2006. So up until then, we were still using the sort of old fermenters as well.
So can you just talk us through the new brew house that you installed?
Yeah, so new brew house went in, like I say, 2007 was sort of the official opening. So relatively, well, it's 2007 now, so it's not that new now, but it's still new in my head. So
even the new brewers call it the new brew house.
They don't even know the old one. Mash conversion vessel, lauter ton, pre-run tank, combined kettle whirlpool. It's also got a wet conditioning mill, and I guess when we first did that, they were all pretty weird things for what was still seen as a very traditional brewery to put in. You know, moving away from traditional dry milling was seen as sort of sacrosanct, really, and moving away from that. And then having a lauter ton as well. And I know several head brewers of comparative breweries who thought that was never going to work. And it seems daft to say it was never going to work, because you think, well, why wouldn't it? But yeah, there was a lot of conversation in the industry that actually you couldn't brew cask beer with a lauter ton. So it went sort of quite away from the old traditional sort of equipment, but didn't go quite as far as mash filters. I think that was still seen as a step too far, particularly because we brewed so many different beers and not always in massive quantities, that it seemed like it wouldn't work. And I know that sort of technology has moved on a lot since then, but certainly when we put that in, that was never really seen as a sort of economical thing to do. And then I guess the big change was really the efficiency. So we put a lot of energy recovery on. So back in 2007, doing energy recovery from the kettle just seemed like an expense that you didn't need to do, but it also seemed like a worthwhile thing to do. And I guess the comparison we always use is it probably saves us about 30% of our gas usage per year by having that energy recovery than the old Victorian brew house. Obviously, that is comparing a very inefficient Victorian brew house to a modern brewery, so that is a little bit unfair. But it does still save us a lot of money by doing that energy recovery.
That's a colossal percentage. Yeah. How did you find? Was there a big flavor difference? Because that is such a change in brew house. How was that? Did you notice it, and did you have to change anything?
Yeah. So I think initially there were flavor differences, and some of it is to do with obviously how the yeast interacts with the work we're now producing off the new brew house. And we'll talk a bit more about the yeast in a bit, because there is a bit more complexity around that. But yeah, initially the first brews tasted nothing like the beer we were trying to make. But like any sensible brewery, you keep doing that until the point where you get close enough before you tell anybody. And so by the time we told anybody, we were running it for about 6 months, at a point where we had actually been selling the beer for about 6 months. So I think the trial process was probably about 3 months until we got to a place where we thought the sort of flavor profile was close enough. But you never really get close enough until you've got that sort of daily brew sort of cycle where you're brewing every day and you're making changes pretty frequently. So I think you can never get to that place without getting to the place where you're selling it as well, because we're not going to dump 100 brews before we get to the perfect place. And also, I think the reality was that actually the new brew house was making the beers better. So even though it might not have been exactly an exact match initially for the beers we were producing before, most of the time those changes were better. The flavor profile was better than what it was.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's. I mean, because I was thinking then, when I've moved breweries and had to replicate beers with similar brew kits, but not, different but similar.
Yeah.
Not that big of a change. It was already a challenge. So I was thinking that is such a big change, and so many flavor drivers in that old Victorian kit.
Yeah. Not all, like I said, not always good flavors. Some of the astringencies we used to get off the old brew house. So some of those lovely cast iron flavors weren't always what we were looking for. And also I think it's true to say that there was much more variability in the old brew house than there is in the current brew house. So you can go from a place where you sort of make one change, what's going to happen, Whereas in the old brew house, that change could have meant 4 or 5 different things happening because it was just
Yeah.
there were so many things that were out of your control. So just simple things like the mash tun temperature that wasn't really wholly in our control because we couldn't change the temperature when it was in the mash tun. So if it was a bit cold that day, then the temperature was a bit lower, and you were relying on people to allow for that in their sort of strike temperatures. Whereas in the new brew house, obviously we take that inconsistency away. And I guess the other bit we talk about a little bit is the timings of hop additions to the kettle. That's automated now, so that we put them into the hop dosing vessels, and those hops go in usually, not always, but usually go in at the time we set them. Whereas in the old brew house, it was down to someone looking at their watch, and if they happened to be called away because the mum was on the phone or whatever, then maybe they went a little bit late or a bit early.
I can't believe it's not bitter.
Yeah. So those it seems like a simple thing, but actually just having consistency of the hops going in at that time every time takes away another variable that you don't have to think about.
Wasn't that what happened when you were commissioning the brew house? The hops didn't actually go
Sometimes the hops didn't go in
at all. Yeah.
It struggled with some of the hop dosing levels that we were trying to put in. But that's what commissioning's for, is to iron out some of those problems.
Some of those small creases that make
No ingredients
hop's not going in.
I think there was no hop. I think old brewer Dan Warner, wasn't he? He said they went all the way into the fermenter without a single hop being added, and you were going to call it, I can't believe it's not bitter.
We did not sell that brew. Yeah.
It's so good. So I think let's move on to the the main thing was those square fermenters. I mean, I've seen them. I was going to call them Southwold square fermenters, but I don't know if that's something anyone's ever used before, or if I can now trademark that term for this podcast.
Well, we can do that.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone else has that sort of vessel anyway.
Do we have to defend the trademark?
Yeah, it will be when we defend. No. We're not registering it.
So yeah, let's talk about those square fermenters. The history of them, everything. I think they're really fascinating and like a real part of this country's kind of tradition in brewing.
Yeah. So if I talk a bit about the history, and then I'll maybe talk about the sort of the operation of them really. So I think that the reality is open fermenters, square fermenters were the easiest thing to brew in, and sort of that is where we imagine that sort of brewing would have started in open fermenters. So it is just an extension of that really. But then I guess the drive for us was really maintaining the yeast that we currently have. And I know it's not always true, but I think for our yeast, open fermenters really is the thing that works. And putting them into conicals, you get a very different sort of interaction really. And that's primarily, I think, because we have a 2-strain yeast sort of culture here, which I never sort of talked about, but that doesn't mean that we need to appease 2 yeast strains, and I think that is always more complicated than just having a single culture where you sort of not always as simple as that, but if you do make one change and one thing happens, whereas I think once you have a sort of mixed culture, you make one change and 20 different things happen, and you've got to try and work out which of those things are being caused by your change, because those yeast strains will react differently. So I think, and the sort of decision to move to sort of the new fermenters sort of came about, let's say, probably 1999-ish, give or take. And then we worked with Briggs in Burton to sort of develop those tanks. And it's probably true that there's been very few new square fermenters put in that time. And primarily that's because it is driven by the yeast. If you've got a single strain yeast, you're probably going conical. Even if you were square before, you're probably going conical. Whereas for us, I think because we knew our yeast had always been a problem. It had been a problem since we started using it in the 1930s, 20s, and it had gone through a series of sort of cleanups. So I guess the history of the yeast is it came from a brewery in Norwich, Morgan's Brewery, and we used to just regularly get their yeast apparently. And then they got bombed in the Second World War, so then we had to become self-sufficient in that yeast. So obviously then we had to have yeast propagations and sort of and keep that yeast going ourselves. And then they looked at it in the 1970s, and on the back of having lots of fermentation problems, so they had lots of inconsistencies, lots of over fermented beer, lots of beer that wasn't dropping bright, lots of micro infections. So they looked at the yeast and decided that there was sort of five different yeast strains in there, but it was sort of dominated by two particular yeast strains, which we now called Gildan 1 and 3, or Class 1 and 3. Very affectionate names, obviously. So they cleaned it up to just have those two yeast strains, because I think they accounted for something like 85% of the sort of cultures that they were looking at. So they cleaned it up to both of those. Now, individually, neither of those brewing strains are good brewing strains. One of them drops out too quickly and doesn't ferment properly. One of them doesn't drop out and over ferments and produces a lot of sulfur along the way. But together they co-flocculate, but you have to keep the sort of proportions sort of relatively even. So I think there was a lot of fear of changing too much, for fear of upsetting the yeast. And I think we take a very much, if we have happy yeast, we have good beer approach to brewing, really. So that was really, the sort of the background to trying to stay with open fermentation without trying to upset the yeast, because I think that sort of yeast character is intrinsic to what we think of as Adnams beer, and we do brew with other yeast strains now, but that we still come back to that having a house character gives you a bit of soul, gives you a point of difference. So we do a lot of painful work about trying to keep that yeast going.
You had quite an interesting anecdote about Bitburger and how we're not alone in that kind of respect, are we?
No, there is. So we import Bitburger and have done for sort of 30 years now, I think, from Germany. So they have this, they have their own yeast strain as well. It's a single strain, but it is their own yeast strain. And the brewery used to be in Bitburger itself, and then they decided they needed to expand, but they didn't have enough space on site, so everyone then looks outside of town. But so they put the brew house outside of town, but they were so fearful of upsetting their yeast, they kept the fermentation in town. So they piped. It was like a 3-mile pipe run from Bitburger out to where the new site is. So they brew it in the new site, pump the work back to Bitburger, ferment it there, and then pump it back out 3 miles to where the packaging hall was. And they did that for, I think they said something like 5 to 10 years, I can't remember exactly, until they were confident they could get the same flavor characteristic in the fermentation vessels in the new brew house. So we're not alone in being very careful with our yeast, because we do think it adds something extra, and for the same reasons Bitburger did it, we think it adds a character that we want to preserve and we want to showcase.
We're just yeast farmers, really.
We are yeast farmers. It is,
which I think that's the fascinating thing about brewing, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure the wine industry internally do talk about yeast, but you don't hear about it as much, do you? It's comparatively to sort of brewing, and I think we're ultimately yeast farmers, and we have to keep the yeast going. Yeah.
That is an absolutely fascinating story, by the way. That is piping it 3 miles to a separate 3 miles back.
Yeah. It's good, isn't it? I like it.
Yeah, that's.
I like that commitment.
It's the commitment.
Yeah, I mean that is serious commitment to like not wanting to disrupt your yeast. That is that is mad. Yeah, that's so cool. I mean, let's go. I mean, let's talk about those square fermenters. You said that you got new ones you say the 1990s, right, Fergus?
So late 1990s, we were sort of in a sort of big growth phase. So we needed more fermentation capacity. So I think the first ones went in before I joined. So about 2001, the first ones went in, and so went in 3 phases. So 2001, 2003, and I think 2005, 6 were the last to go in. So I'd like Dan, you can talk a little bit about, I guess, how they operate.
Yeah, I guess we sort of talk about square fermenters being kind of rare, but really that's what everybody brewed in. The cylindrical conical is relatively a new invention, say like the 1920s, and one of the benefits from CCVs, I guess, is the automation of the brewing. You can harvest yeast from the bottom, and actually I think in the 60s. Bit before my time, but everyone talks about Watney Red Barrel, and one of the things that allowed that kind of large scale commercial brewing was the fact that they actually had what was a top fermenting yeast in a CCV, and it became bottom fermenting. So I think Watney's had a paper in the 60s, round putting a top fermenting yeast into a CCV. And I know similar, I mean, they did that, what was it? When did they do that? Fuller's?
I think late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah. So you could turn our yeast into a bottom fermenting yeast. In fact, actually class 3. So the Gilliand classification system was done by a brewery for working for Guinness in the 1950s, and it's just the different classes kind of associated. It is quite sort of superficial because it's just looking at sort of flocculation or the lack of flocculation. So you can have more than one yeast within the class 3 classification system, but loosely it's a good way for us to differentiate between our two sort of brewing yeasts. But class 3 is really flocked in, like Fergus said. It makes amazing when you propagate it alone in the lab. You have these amazing sort of like discs, like UFO sort of discs, and it just sediments out. So it works really well in actually CCVs. And we did a collaborative brew with Brew York, and we actually sent them just class 3 so they could ferment with it in their CCVs, and that worked pretty well. But with the squares, for the operation of the squares, I think one of the real benefits from using the squares is for cask. So a lot of people used to historically prime cask, and it's not actually that long ago. Again, thinking about that, brewers used to pay on OG, and what was it, early 90s. So with that, there's a long history of brewers using sugar and priming sugar. And one of the great things about having like a sort of square fermenter where you're harvesting from the top, if the yeast is imbalanced, the timing of your yeast harvest really controls the fermentation. So you can kind of stop the fermentation, sort of leaving some residual sugar. And I don't know if it's just the romance. I really like that. I mean, we'll get into how to manage a dual strain in a minute, but it can be I think we both like this sort of romance around using,
but it's
the craft.
It's stories, and I think the more you stay in the sort of in brewing industry, you realize that actually most of the time we're selling stories. Really, that's sort of that's what we're in the business of. And you can you can manufacture a story, or you can try and use what you've already got. And we've been gifted some really, really valuable things where we've got some history and some good stories to tell people. Although our marketing team don't like the word fermentation, so we try and stay away from talking about fermentation specifically. I think it's too complicated a word for people. But having a link to that sort of historic yeast strain, having some links to sort of the past, I think it can be a really useful story as long as you're not stuck in it. I think you don't want to be absolutely stuck in your history and in your past, but I think you can use it and help to build that story, I think.
Yeah, and I guess what you've done is kind of, in a way, modernize and adapt. Let's say the square fermenters, and the brew house is different, but there's the square fermenters themselves. So you're still keeping a lot of the elements, but I guess you've made some changes they've made some changes since those late 90s ones from the earlier ones, and to make them maybe more efficient, use less losses, harvest more efficiently.
Yeah, so obviously probably the biggest change is they're lidded, so they're not completely open. I think
that did change the beer for the worse, apparently. Apparently you need a pigeon or two in the beer to really Adnams beer was never the same again.
Any brewery who has had open fermenters has definitely got some stories about finding things in the bottom of a vessel after they've emptied it, whether that's pigeons or cats or maybe I think one or two have found some human beings in there, but generally pigeons and cats I think are what people find. And so ours are lidded, so that can't happen. Although it bounces into things that can't get out.
They just can't get out now.
Yeah. What's that banging?
I think was it Michael Ladd, one of our old HR. What he used to do Adnams brewery tours, And when he used to give the sort of public a tour around the brewery, one of his favourite quips was, we've only had sort of 2 deaths on a Adnams brewery tour. One of them was one person drowned in the fermenter, but they managed to get out 6 times to have a wee first. So.
Yeah. Not true, just to be absolutely clear.
I'm editing that part out. That's gospel. I remember it was a guy I used to work with in one of the breweries I first started at, and he said when they were, I mean, I probably don't know if I should say the name of the brewery, but I think it was Tetley's, so who cares? And they used to, like, when they finished their shift, they all used to get a mug and just scoop out lots of fermenters, like, just and they'd all like pass around beers by literally just scooping them out the tops of open top fermenters.
Yeah, I think that's highly likely.
Yeah,
I think I think there's a sort of off topic a bit, but we used to have a cellar. Well, we still have a cellar, but the cask beer used to go down into the cellar for a sort of week before it was sort of taken back up and sold. And as they were rolling it in, there's a bit where it's got to get through a sort of curve. So they had someone in the cellar whose only job was really to make sure those casks got round the curve without getting stuck. And he had a bucket of beer right beside him that he would help himself to all day, and then moaned about the fact every now and again he had to get up and actually move a cask around the corner, which is the only reason he was in the cellar in the first place. But yeah, I think most breweries of an age will have stories of people on bottling lines, on kegging lines, in tank farms with a bucket of beer. That obviously is not something we encourage anymore. We typically have rules to stop that. But that is part and parcel of where the brewing industry has been, and I think that is fact for most breweries of an age.
Actively discourage.
We actively discourage now. Thank you, Dan. We actively discourage.
We put lids on their buckets,
We put lids on the buckets.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool. So let's dive into this dual yeast strain, because it is a thing of, it's a work of art to manage that. We've worked together on contract brewing and stuff, so I've seen firsthand some of the things you both have to do in order to manage yeast strains that 99.99% of craft brewers just don't even worry about. So maybe we can just go through that, because I think it's fascinating, and there'll be a lot of people listen to this who probably just pitch dry yeast on top of the tank and walk away. So this is the other side of that, which is managing a dual yeast strain with propagation.
We don't.
We don't manage it.
That's the super answer. We have some plasters. You can never really. I've been thinking about this a lot recently, because you have your ups and downs, and the thing is, things change all the time, and you have to. I think malt, for example, is really interesting. Some of the things that can affect, like pre-flocculation, for example. So class 3, one of our biggest issues with managing the yeast strain is class 3 basically drops out too early, and essentially class 1 sort of takes over. And class 1 is really non-flocculent, so you get really high yeast counts, and as Fergus said before, it just chews through any sort of residual sort of sugar in the fermentation. But I know there's a lot of work been done on like pre-flocculation, but there's things in our malt specification that you just can't define. So the microflora in the field affects some of these precursors for like pre-flocculation in the grain, and therefore the malt, and we just have no control over that, and that will always be like that. And one year it might be better than another year, but that is part and parcel. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we'll never truly fix our yeast. It will always. So our management techniques is to have like a continuous propagation. So I think it's definitely got worse, I think, over certain periods of time, where I think when we started, we didn't need to continuously propagate as much. But as you sort of tweak things in the brewery to control, say, attenuation limits, inevitably, actually, we end up causing an issue for class 3. So class 3 tends to like a bit more of the simple sugars. It's not as favorable come sort of malt trios, so it tends to drop out before the sort of fermentation is sort of finished. So with higher MCV temperatures, we so in the mash, particularly with the mill star, I think we one of probably the things that probably you never think about from going from a mash tun to wet conditioned milling. So if anybody is doing cask beer, one of the things to really consider is the dough in times, because I think it gets talked about, but I mean, I think Tetley's were in a similar position, or Foster's, sorry. They had like a 5-minute mash stand, because when you're doughing in, because the starchy endosperm is, wet, the dough in time is, part of your mash stand really. So I think that's the one thing, as we've got improved our sort of control, that's actually probably consequently made it harder to sort of manage class 3. So the continuous propagation needs to keep happening. So essentially what we're doing is every 2 weeks, we have class 3 sort of sent to us sort of quarterly from the yeast bank, and we kind of make our own slopes, and then from those slopes we grow up class 3, which goes from sort of 100 milliliter, as bigger, and then we eventually pitch it into a brew. But we're continuously that last stage of the propagation system. We have like a 5-barrel propagation vessel. So once we've gone from the lab to that first stage in there, we'll sort of pitch in 4 barrels of the wort, and then sort of leave 20%, and then top it up with fresh wort, and we just keep this continuous propagation system going, so we can maximize the amount of class 3 we're putting into the pitching yeast to maintain that sort of 50-50 balance. So it's a hell of a lot of work in the the laboratory, the brewers, so why do we do it? I guess because it's kind of like family, isn't it?
Yeah.
We can't just chuck it out the door, can we?
You're longer than we have. So.
Yeah. So and then on the plus side, yes, it is a really difficult yeast strain to sort of manage, but it's just absolute. On its day, it's so beautiful. I think like the sort of flavor profile is sort of next to none, and that in combination with the square fermentation vessels, it's just the ester profile. So the main thing with the square fermentation is the aspect ratio, right? So that's the big difference. And having that sort of lower aspect ratio, you just have CO2 evolution happens easier, so you get more ester production. And our yeast is sort of really, it's kind of like a Belgian ale yeast, really. It's fantastic for those kind of styles of beer. When we put in the new cellar, we'll be calling the new cellar, never sell it for about 50 years. So we in sort of 2015, as kegging beer was sort of growing, we used to use banks for all of that. So there was also the kind of would become Gaucher 015, the sort of no and low. So it was sort of finished in 2018, the new cellar, where we brought bright beer for processing on site. So prior to that, we literally just did cask on site. So we brought in CCVs, centrifuge, filtration, kegging, and then that allowed to do the sort of processing for the reverse osmosis for the dealkalization of the Gaucher 0.5. So when we were putting in those dual sort of purpose vessels, we did do some experiments with brewing like broadside in CCV, and it just wasn't the same. It was so different. We didn't have to do very many trials. And actually, there's something to be said as well. It's not just the romance with the squares. I think from a brewing perspective, like you feel, you just feel so part of the process. You go and open up a hood and you actually can see the yeast head, and you know what the kind, you know, if you sort of know by looking at it sort of vague. I don't know if we're within 1% of that, of how good it is, what the balance of the yeast is, but there's a lot of things that you can still observe by the yeast head top of fermenting. So that's something that I really, really like. And I know, you know, we're not the only people who sort of swear by sort of open squares, so to speak. I know Schönrammer in sort of Bavaria, it's all about the open squares. So it's, you know, we're not the only advocate of squares, and certainly the sulfur scrubbing is next to none. So I think at some point we'll probably talk about sort of contract brewing, where we've had to, well, we did some for yourself, obviously, but we have done some lagers as well. And
I think most of the contract brewing we do is lager.
Everyone's capacity, isn't it? But the squares are beautiful for lagers. I think it just, again, that sulfur scrubbing, a little bit of esters. I think Rod White was talking about Madry the other week at a lecture, and whether you like Madry or not, we won't get into that debate. He was talking about some of the market research about what makes a really great lager. And anyway, some of the research back is actually people like a little bit of ester profile. So again, with this, with even with brewing lagers,
I thought you were going to tell me Madgy was made in squares.
That would be mad.
I didn't know where you were going. That's right.
Yeah,
Spanish square fermenters. That's what we'd have to call them.
Yeah, Spanish squares. Yeah, so it's and you know, like the likes of Heineken, you know, they ferment in horizontal, you know, horizontal, cylindrical. So yeah, there's a lot to be said for the square
profile,
and why we would give ourselves such a lot of work.
Well, I think that on the yeast, it's a relatively flexible yeast because it's two strains. You can play more tunes with it in terms of flavor profiles than you can in single strain. So I think we can talk a lot about the extra work it takes to manage it, but I think we still are on the side that it's worth the extra work. But there is no question it is extra.
Yeah, and do you ever play with the balance? So you said like 50-50, right, between the class 1 and class 3? Is like, when does that percentage shift? Does it start to cause a problem?
70-30 is the kind of, in both ways. Okay, is the kind of, that's kind of the bandwidth that we're sort of looking for. Yeah.
And what happens if it's 71 or 7 to the other? Like, what sort of differences do you see, like flavor wise, performance wise?
I think if class 1 starts to get above sort of 70%, then the phenolic side comes higher. I think both yeasts are POF positive, but it's the contact. I think it's that additional contact time that you have with the high yeast counts. With on the other side, also sulfur. You get a lot more sulfur, and then on the
high yeast counts
and then on the other side, I guess the beer's a little bit sweeter, because if class 3 was above 70%, you probably end up getting a lot of stuck fermentations if it was too high, and you wouldn't get any yeast recovery.
There's no yeast cropping.
Yeah, pretty big differences.
Yeah.
It's really fun.
Not always fun.
It's good to know that we know nothing, really.
I think as long as you accept you're not wholly in charge, then you get on fine.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about the levels of microflora in the fields of where the barley is grown, then I mean, you are thoroughly out of control, really. But it must be really fascinating, actually, because, you know, as I said, for a lot of people, it's just kind of pour in and close the lid and walk away. But actually, a lot of the science and the kind of the real skill of a brewer is in balancing two yeast strains.
Yeah.
That trying to get repeatable, consistent beers. And that's probably a good question. Like, how do you find the consistency across, let's say, I mean, Ghost Ship, you make it so often now, but like, how do you still see issues with the consistency from your sensory analysis because of the yeast strain, or do you think you're in a good control of it?
I think we always know. I think even people working for AB InBev, where Budweiser is being brewed on 10 different sites, will probably tell you what site Budweiser is being brewed on.
Right. True.
And so you get to know your beer, right? And I think Scott from Sierra Nevada was telling he can always tell the difference between the two different breweries. So I think with like a mixed culture, I think you always notice these. It's just how big that sort of difference is. So I think I think our beer is pretty consistent. But there is times where, I think when the yeast does go out of balance, it's, sometimes it gets like bottled broadside, for example, the way that we ferment with a really high OG, that will get really exaggerated in that beer. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes you get like this real sort of faint smoky, actual smoky note, which I sometimes quite like in the background. But when we have broadside, so we taste obviously beer every day, and we have our tasting panel meets at 10:30 every morning, and we have 8 beers to taste. Mixture of shelf life, freshly packaged stuff, in process stuff, and the last beer we always taste is bottled broadside, and the game is to try and guess when it was packaged, and it's largely really difficult. So I think, but sometimes you think back, the yeast was slightly out of balance about 4 months ago. I wonder if that was a bit smoky. I don't know if that's 4 months ago, So, but largely we don't know. So I guess the answer is actually it's pretty consistent, man, and it is quite difficult to tell the difference. So yeah.
So I'd agree. I think it is largely really consistent, but I think even batch to batch, if you know your brand really well, you'll pick up differences, and that's true for every brewery. But I don't think if we wanted to find a place where we were ultimately getting 100% consistency day in, day out, I don't think you wouldn't be brewing it. You wouldn't be using malt. You wouldn't be using hops. You're adding too much inconsistency in. Clearly wouldn't be using yeast, too much inconsistency. So if your ultimate lane is we want 100% control of this product, you're not brewing it. You're buying in ethanol and some flavorings. So I think you sort of, and from my point of view, I like the challenge of trying to get to a place where it is recognizably that product, starting from things that are inconsistent. And I know you've had Jamie on, but I think even Jamie would admit there's barley is not wholly consistent, and you would never expect it to be. Hops are not wholly consistent, and you would never expect them to be. We try and work within parameters, but I think the challenge for brewing, and the thing I enjoy about brewing, is the fact that it's not a dead set that you're going to get there every time. That there is some inconsistency, there is a challenge to it. You are working with natural ingredients that don't always want to do the thing you want them to do. There is that inconsistency built into it, and I think you either enjoy that challenge or you don't.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I think it's as much as we say it's a headache, it's definitely part of the charm. It's what that continuous improvement. I mean, that yeast aspect just makes such a massive difference, and that's what makes it so enjoyable, isn't it? But the meaning of life is you create meaning, don't you? And that's to try.
There we go. We're back to the first question.
Yeah.
What are you?
What am I?
Yeah, that was my first question. Yeah.
Yeast farmer.
I always use this quote that you. I don't know if you remember saying it, Fergus, but when we were working together, you said brewing's like a game of whack-a-mole. It's like,
I think
one problem and 2 more pop up, and I was like, I say that all the time to people. Like, it's just the perfect analogy of brewing, and it's like that's why it's so fun. It's because you're like, oh, I solved a problem, and here's 2 more to solve, and it's just like a never-ending game.
We don't know everything, and we never will. That doesn't mean you stop trying to know more. I think you still want to try and understand more, but I think you have to accept you will never know all of it.
Yeah.
And as long as you start from that point, then I think you can happily work in that area. I think if you think you're going to get to a point where you know absolutely everything, then I think you might as well stop now, because you're not going to get there. But you can always know more.
Did you know on the whack-a-mole thing, Chris, that there's moles that you can't even see that are popping up that are not even on the board?
It was definitely Dan's crop, definitely.
I just visions of you like on a whack-a-mole thing, just hitting things that aren't there.
Yeah,
this guy. You can't even see them all, man.
They're not in front of you. They're behind you. They're there. That's another conversation.
Moles upon moles.
Yeah. Is this a Q mole? Yeah, there you go.
Do you so when you're using
spread out, Chris, it's fun.
when you're comparing, because you say you use other yeast strains as well, right? It's not just you're not just using the dual class 1 and class 3. How, in terms of like yeast health, do you make any changes, or like how does it compare to the different yeast strains that you use when they're kind of singular, I guess?
Well, I guess when we change on, like now, routine is to get some analysis done on things like fan and like that. We use Yeast Fit as a sort of standard edition. So we'll sort of tweak it up and down depending on what we need to do. We use Zinc as a standard edition. Again, something that we can tweak up and down as required. So I guess for dried yeast, I guess it's a bit more standard, I would say. But for ours, we can we'll tweak that up and down. But we tend to, it's probably more reactionary than proactive. We'd love it to be more proactive, but sometimes you need to get some data before you can make those changes.
Especially when there's so many other variables as well, right? So
I don't think we don't use the dried yeast often enough to get enough of a data picture, really.
Yeah. What sort of styles does this yeast really lend itself to? And I guess in tandem with the squares, but what sort of
Belgian
beer styles do you think it really excels in?
It's a wannabe Belgian, really.
It's a Belgian style.
I think it's an expat from Belgium.
Yeah.
And I think that's generally true. I think we do some lovely Belgian sort of profile beers. So there's a really, I think you've done a wit beer, which is beautiful. I think there's a
Belgian blonde.
There's a Belgian blonde, which has all the I think drinking you wouldn't know it wasn't Belgian. So I think it's natural happy place is in Belgium, which we're not too far out. I think a couple of stones through across the water, we'd be there.
Yeah.
So we're pretty close.
The triple, we do a sort of Belgian style triple as well. Bitch, again, really great.
Yeah. So a lot of I think for a lot of the mainstream beers, we're trying to not let it show too much, that sort of natural sort of tendency it wants to have. But you can always pick it up in the background. I think classically people have always described the Adnams yeast, or even things like Southwold bitter, as having a sort of spicy characteristic. And I think that is really what people mean. It is that sort of slightly, that slight phenolic note in the background. That's really what people are sort of really trying to describe.
That's so cool. So unique as well, right? Because that's really sets your beers apart from other bitters, for example, which is, probably using very similar yeast strains in the UK or abroad. That adds so much uniqueness to a style. Yeah.
And I think it's one of the things you sort of lean into or you try and shy away from. I think we sort of do a bit of both. I think we have lent into it recently with some of the more Belgian style beers that Dan's put together. But for a lot of the sort of mainstream beers, you try and rein it back. But it still adds that subtleness in the background. So you can never get rid of it completely. It is still there. So you have to try and build it into the profile of what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
But I
like that. Yeah.
I like the fact it is something that is not wholly replicable by other people. It is not something that everyone's going to be producing. I like and we talk about the same thing on water, really. We don't have an RO sort of system here for the brewed water. We do work with the water that is coming out of the tap, basically. And I like the fact it has a resonance for where it's made. That is part of the story for me. It is the fact that actually lots of what we make is not going to be something you can just go and brew another kit somewhere else.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it'd be almost impossible, right, to do like a.
Nothing's impossible, but I think it'd be difficult, and I like the fact it's difficult.
Yeah. And how did you? Because of course, I'd say whatever in the last 15 years, 20 years, however long it's been since dry hopping started to become more everywhere. How did that interact with the sort of the ester characters, and how did that interact with the yeast? And was that like a weird challenge to overcome?
I actually think the squares are pretty good for dry hopping, actually, and some of the issues around the squares are sort of built around 7-day residency. That's you and properly cask conditioned beer. You're not going from to a conditioning tank or any of that, and conditioning the beer at the brewery. It's 7 days in the FV, and then it's out into cask, and that secondary fermentation really does happen in the cask. So the brewery has been built around that, for the right reasons. And as we have done more and more different types of beer, with the addition of dry hopping, it does put a pressure on the FV capacity. So that is a challenge. Is tank turnaround time, and even if you had loads more squares, it's the timing as well is a real issue. So even given more time, you don't always want more time in the FV. I think part of the timing of the skimming of the yeast harvest, the winter time, it tends to drop in a little bit more in the summer, so you get a fluctuation with the season as well. You get like this kind of leftover bit of krausen on the top, which really protects the beer from their open fermenters, right? So it gives it a microbial protection, but also oxidation. So I think one of the main challenges with the dry hopping is the timing of the dry hop. And it's really quite a compromise for dry hopping. It'd be great to be able to have lower yeast counts, chill the beer for various reasons, but you can't really do that in an open fermentation. If you start putting the cooling on, putting the brakes on, and then leave it in the same tank open to air, you're just going to cause all sorts of issues. So you kind of have to dry hop at your sort of final kind of temperature at the end of free rise. So that can be a bit of an issue. But overall, actually, when it comes to extraction efficiency, I think the squares are brilliant. We were talking about the aspect ratio being really positive for the ester profile, well, for the contact and for beer on hops is great. So, you can do some pretty high dry hopped beers, and actually losses are relatively lower than what they would be in a CCV, and you get such good extraction. So the time that takes, I think when we were doing some experiments for the contract brewing with you, when we did it in the squares initially, we were talking about like 24-hour sort of dry hopping times, and we consequently moved to CCV just to be more in line with what you're doing at about 50 sites. But yeah, so yeah, the extraction is amazing, is really good. So there's some really good positive things. The losses, I think we could probably get better at losses, but relatively the losses aren't probably as high as we see in CCV. If we probably, if you redesigned them, probably have an adjustable mushroom. So the mushroom is just like kind of like the racking arm. It sort of protects the outlet of the tank. So I think if you redesigned them, I'd probably there'd be two things I would do. I'd have an adjustable racking arm, and I'd have them so that you could pressurize them, so that after primaries sort of finished, you could start sort of spunding the tanks and just protect them. That would be the two things I'd change really, or advanced. So if Briggs are listening,
next time, Ray was knocking on the door to put in new squares.
But we did look at pressurizing the tank. They're not pressure rated because we were looking at CO2 recovery. So I guess that's talking about one of the other things that aren't particularly good on squares is CO2 recovery. Obviously, there's been a few people come into the game who have a bit, like Dallin work, and they've been doing a lot of work with SSV and have got CO2 recovery working on relatively smaller volumes, whereas we got laughed out the room, didn't we?
I think it's technically possible to recover CO2 from open squares with a sort of hood, basically, but the efficiency is going to be obviously a lot less. So your sort of payback's going to be a bit longer. So, but it is technically possible. But when we did talk to a couple of CO2 sort of recovery companies, 3-4 years ago. They said the best thing for us to do is just buy a large tank and fill it with CO2
when it's cheap.
And then use it or sell it. That was their advice to us at the time. Become CO2 merchants, and that was their advice.
What brewing volume are you with squares? Whoa! Laughed out the room, but
I wouldn't. I didn't consider that, which is not in line with what I do regularly. But the recapture side would be quite difficult.
Yeah, it is. It is
on
possible.
A square. It's possible.
I think
it's possible.
Yeah, it is possible. And I did talk to someone who was brewing in the sort of 70s, and they said they did do it for a bit at one of the sort of breweries in.
Really?
Yeah, one of the breweries in Burton, I think, did it. Usually inefficient, so they obviously stopped doing it, but it is possible.
It's just that interface at the start as well of fermentation. You've got obviously a lot of air in the tank initially, and it's that change from when you start collecting and then
Yeah, well, I mean, talking about operational, how difficult is it to clean a square or fermenter? How do you do that? Is there anything different to a CCV, or is it just spray ball and
spray ball?
Yeah. I think there was some software that they used for getting the amount of time so that the spray ball covers every single part of the tank. So that compared to a CCV is going to obviously be...
Yeah, you've got corners to work with.
Yeah.
I think times in the amount of water is higher. I think on cleaning squares, but they're not like the old vessels where we had to go in and clean them with a yellow scrubbing pad. You can use them with the spray ball now, and they clean really well. But you do have to use more water comparatively than a sort of conical vessel.
Yeah. And it's that interface, isn't it, as well, at the end of the tank when it's draining down. And so they're a little bit more complicated, but I think, but it's the same for CCVs, the principles and, I guess not having blocked spray balls and keeping and having good, and just having good. Managing your CIP sets and making sure you're looking after that and we use a lot of. I think that's probably one of our largest increases in water usage compared to the CCVs is getting rid of the bottoms before CIP.
Yeah.
So we have, we have to. I forget how much we use, but it's it's another pre-flush that goes to our settlers, which goes out as waste yeast. So there's an additional step, which is a bit more, which is uses a bit more water on top of that. So
I can imagine that. I mean, as you said, like rectangles, corners, a little bit harder to clean, more surface area. Like the bottom is a lot harder to clean. Yeah. What was I going to ask next? Oh, yeah. So one question I definitely had was on yeast harvesting. Like, how does that look for in a square fermenter? And maybe the second part to that question would be, how does that affect your yeasts? And do you have different techniques that you would think it would be standard because you're dual yeast strain for yeast harvesting?
I think the actual process of yeast harvesting is, although we were digging out some cupboards the other day, and there was some sort of hand sketches of automating.
So it's not automated, but there were some. And originally, when they put them in 2001, they did look at a way of trying to automate the yeast harvesting. But I think in the end, it was a huge amount of complexity in terms of pipe work and then cleaning, and wasn't worth it basically. So it is manual. So it is we lower in a sort of stainless steel sort of upturned funnel and get it to the sort of level of the interface between the yeast and the beer. And then basically vacuum that across into the yeast storage tank. So it's not hugely complicated. I think the thing that is always critical is the timing of it. And I think there is a sort of general, we're sort of 2 days after start of fermentation is when we sort of 40 hours when we start looking to skim it. But it does really depend on that beer as well, and you do have to adjust it depending on whether it's doing what you want it to do.
Yeah, definitely. I think again, observation. You can actually see if the yeast head is starting to fall in. So you might have to make a decision of taking the yeast early, depending on what beer it is, and if you need the recovered yeast for subsequent brewing.
Yeah, sometimes there's a necessity to skimming.
Yeah, well, brewing's just a compromise, isn't it?
Yeah. If we have no yeast, then you're skimming that beer.
Yeah.
You might not wholly skim it, but you need to bring off it.
Yeah. Fortunately, all the CIP around the I guess all the CIP in the yeast room and stuff, that's all automated. So I think historically back in the day, I think yeast once got CIP to do it, and then you had to go back and reskin. Yeah. What we bring with today. Yeah. But we went on to barm yeast in the early 90s. So I guess there was, maybe I'm being too romantic about this story, but we'll see. I think Adnams had 2 really bad yeast infections. There was always a slight infection, to be honest, but they had a really bad one in the late 1980s. So Pichia, it was a wild yeast. And the person that I originally took over from at Adnams had sort of worked at Adnams since like the early 70s. And he was the sort of Adnams yeast expert, really, Philip May. And one of the things he told me, he said, I knew there was something wrong with the yeast when it turned pink. But they used to have a yeast press, and I think Jonathan had bought the yeast press secondhand from Young's Brewery. So I think Young's had three yeast presses at one point. And before a yeast press, unknown to me, they had a yeast table. And that was what they were using before the yeast press.
What's a yeast table?
It does exactly what it says on the tin. It's according to Jonathan, it was literally, again, having cloths, but it just sat on a table and you had a vacuum pump.
Oh, so it's a yeast press.
Yes, but on a table. But not as many plates as a yeast press.
Yeast presses are terrible things.
Yeah, so that was where the sort of infection had storing the yeast cake. And then there was another sort of really bad infection in the early 90s, not quite as bad. And with the way that duty then changed, the decision was to take the sort of upgrade to a barm yeast system, which we have today. So we store the yeast under beer. The sort of distance that the yeast has to travel from the fermentation room to the storage vessels is not ideal. I think if we were to, I looked at different pumps. We currently employ like a liquid ring pump, but the shear forces are quite high on that, so it's not particularly good for the yeast. But again, there's not really a better pump out there. You would probably, on paper, use something like a peristaltic pump. but because it's so gassy and we're having to pump at such a large distance, that's the kind of pump we have to employ. But like Fergus said, it's still pretty hands-on on that side, and the lowering of the funnel to the beer level is done by feel, because you can't actually see where the level of the beer is because you've got the yeast head. So the funnel starts. You can feel the funnel floating as it becomes buoyant on the surface of the beer. So that's still done sort of by hand, and it sort of gets pumped to farm use. But the micro it obviously definitely improved back on the microbiological side, and I think talking about consistency. So consistency isn't just about the flavors you want. It's about not having the flavors you don't want, right? And hygiene is such a massive part of brewing. Really, it's 90% of brewing really is hygiene, isn't it? And I think the yeast handling side and talking about management of the yeast, that's that's another part of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's really fascinating. I feel like, this whole thing, both the squares and the yeast itself, is like, it's such a really important part of the brewing heritage of this country.
Yeah.
And I think it's really great that you guys are still continuing this on, even though that, on a side-by-side comparison, it might be slightly harder to deal with. But I feel like, on the sake of how important this is and how unique the beers are at Adnams because of this yeast, I think it's like really, really important work to keep it going. So yeah, I think it's really great that you guys are doing that, and it's been like genuinely really interesting to hear how it's managed, the flavors it gets, especially interaction with the square fermenters as well. It's not something that you would see very often in craft breweries anymore, but actually, as you said, some of the best beers both like in this country and Shunrama, as you mentioned, for me is one of my favorite breweries in the world, and they're still operating these squares because of the flavors that they get and the way that it works. I think it's really awesome to hear about this. I think it's really great. You guys are doing a really good job of like keeping the heritage going. I mean, I had Ben and Rob from Thornbridge on, who saved one of the unions as well. Yeah. So I feel like I think it's really cool that we're still keeping the brewing heritage going, even if some parts of the craft beer world are going in different directions. I think it's really cool.
Yeah, but it still has to be relevant, though. You still have to deliver flavors that people are interested in and people want. So it can't just be heritage for heritage's sake. It has to be something that still ties into into a commercial reality that we all still need to sell it. We don't want to stick it on a shelf in a library. We want to make beer that people enjoy and still drink. So I think we have to be careful about overplaying the heritage. It still has to be something that people want.
Yeah, totally. I mean, otherwise it will just be a museum piece, right?
Yes.
But yeah, I guess have you made any changes due to let's say the resurgence or the rise of craft beer, so to speak, as a category? Have you made any changes to because Adnams were going, as you said, since like the 20s. So have you made any adaptations or changes to the yeast to the
1872, Chris? 20s. It's not
1872.
1872.
Oh, it is written on the bottle.
It's written on the bottle. Yeah. How many times have you been here? I think no brewery, really can say they haven't taken a sort of a look at where craft brewing has sort of gone in the world, really, not just the UK, but and so that has affected the sort of styles of beer we do, the sort of hops we use, and the marketing of things. So I think everyone would have taken a note of where things have gone. Even those breweries that are very much about the history will have still made a nod to actually where things have gone in terms of flavor profiles.
Timothy Taylor's are doing collabs.
Timothy Taylor did a collab. They did a really hoppy beer. What's it called? Hop Store. So even what we would consider as really traditional sort of beers, breweries have all taken a note of what people drink, and that's what it comes down to. It's not just about the fact it's craft beer; it's really about what people want to drink. Because like I said, we don't want to be a museum. We want to still be relevant. We want to still make beers that people want to drink. And if that means it's not all Fuggles, well, that's all right. We quite like some Citras and some Mosaics and some. People have gone on Sriracha, but we don't really like Sriracha.
Well, Fuggles can be pretty peachy and lemony, you know. Yeah, I think there's a scale there. There is a scale, I guess. I was talking to Will because we were talking about like hop selection and like you know consistency in beers, and Will was talking about the fact that he sort of feels Fuggles has changed since the advent of mechanical picking. So they basically have to pick Fuggles a lot earlier than what they would have done like some kind of 50 years ago, 60 years ago. So the oils don't quite develop as much because the kind of cone opens up and it gets shattered too much. So they tend to pick it a lot earlier than what historically they would. Now, I'm not saying it necessarily was really lemony and peachy, but it can definitely have a real lemony note. So
we did have a Fuggle sample that was really grapefruity once.
Yeah, alpha of 8.4.
8% alpha, it's that.
8.42, 5.
We strongly suspect it was a mislabeled sample.
But a lot of the traditional beer drinkers do, you know, when Ghost Ship came out, very, very traditional beer drinkers liked, you know, surprisingly, you know, they like those flavors, or not surprisingly, you know, it's, I think all the different terroirs of the world have something to offer beer, right? And, you know, we like New Zealand terroir, we like the Australian terroir, we like the US, and England has its own terroir, which is changing, isn't it, with climate change, I think.
Yeah.
You know, so who knows what kind of hops they'll grow in the UK in the future. But, yeah, but you have to be relevant, I guess. And, you know, we talk about Southwold Bitter being this legacy beer, but it was only the sort of 50s.
Yeah.
So 1872, Chris. So like even the, you know, Southwold Bitter wasn't the bread and butter, you know, tally ho and other, you know, mild, you know, you think how mild has been and gone for most breweries. Yeah, things do change, don't they, over time?
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think you change with it, don't you? Yeah. There's no brewery out there that has completely stood it in its place when it was first sort of founded. Every brewery will have changed over time. This analogy doesn't work anymore, but we used to say you've got to be like Madonna. You've got to reinvent yourself. Half your listeners don't even know who Madonna is anymore. But yeah, you have to reinvent yourself otherwise you're not relevant. And if you want to still have a business, you still have to be relevant enough.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the thing with the craft, that I guess we're not alone in those conversations where do you pretend to be someone else, or are you yourself? I guess I think you've always gone down that you can't really pretend you're somebody else.
Nope.
You know.
No, I don't think it works. I don't know of any successful brewery that has managed to pretend to be someone else. Maybe there's an exception in Burton on Trent, but I can't remember now.
The Spanish squares.
The Spanish squares.
Spanish squares is so good. Yeah, it's some wonderful points, and you know, I feel consumers can always spot inauthentic brands, and not just breweries, but brands in general. No. So yeah, it's really important that people do stay to true to themselves. It doesn't mean that things can't change within that, but the way that you present yourself and the way that you come across, I think it still has to be who you are.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, the Steve Buscemi meme when he walks with the skateboards, like, hello, fellow kids. It's like, that's exactly how I see some brands, and I'm like, oh no.
Yeah, I think it's described as Dan dancing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so good. So, I mean, regular listeners of this podcast will know that I always ask for 3 things at the end of the podcast. So I've been thinking about it whilst we've been talking, but I'm going to go something that probably is pretty generic, but I'm actually like, we talked so much about different parts. I think it'd be nice to bring it all together. So in your guys' opinions, what are the 3 best impacts a square fermenter has on your beer?
Dan's already mentioned it, but I think that scrubbing aspect is really important to us. Partly because our yeast does produce a lot of sulfur, so actually having a process that scrubs that really well and we know from the comparison with the CCVs that the squares have a hugely beneficial impact on that.
Footprint. Or
footprint's great.
Has a massive impact. You can fit it in really small space.
And then I guess the ester profile, I think that is hugely important to beers like Broadside. That ester profile from those squares is it's such a huge part of that flavor. It's not as big a part of some other beers, but for Broadside particularly, that is a phenomenal sort of percentage of that flavor in the end.
And just, I guess, provenance, history, USP, whatever label that comes under. It's part of our DNA.
You're not going to get footprint.
No footprint. Is that full impact?
We'll take footprint.
Okay, take footprint.
It's so good. It's got a top 4. The only one that's ever had a top 4.
But yeah, because apparently there's DNA.
Okay, brilliant. I really appreciate those guys, and look, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really, really appreciate it. I know you guys have got, again, like everyone who comes on has got super busy schedules. So yeah, I really, really appreciate it. And I feel like the listeners are going to there are some absolutely amazing stories and like brewing history, but also how that's being adapted to, like, let's say, like contemporary brewing as well. I think it was really fascinating. So thank you so much for sharing everything. It was genuinely really, really great, and great to see you again. Hopefully I can come to Southwold
always nice
soon enough.
Thank you, Chris. Brilliant.
Thank you so much, guys. Take care. Well, thank you so much to Dan and Fergus for that awesome episode. That anecdote about Bitburger was crazy, as well as just how there is a romantic side to managing those yeast strains and how unique that is. I feel like as a brewer, it's just as I said so many times on the episode, sometimes, and I've done it before, it's quite easy to pitch your yeast and walk away, but to have that level of complexity on top of your already very complex brewery and beer styles, I think it's so cool. It's like a real, I don't want to say art, but it's a real, maybe it is a bit of an art. I'm normally very much in the camp of brewing is science, not art, but there is an element of art to that, and definitely a bunch of romance to that story, and I think it's really cool that, and something really important, that we keep that going. I think it's great part of the industry, and the history of making beer is 5,000 years old. It's not 10 like we sometimes think it is. So I think it's really important to keep these things going. So yeah, anyone enjoyed that episode, please, as always, just share it across your channel, share it with a friend, with a colleague. That would be really awesome. And I will catch you on the next episode of the Modern Brewer Podcast.